The massive stone chamber shook as Elder Pyraxis slammed his clawed fist against the ancient table. Dragons filled every corner of the hall, their eyes glowing like stars in the darkness. Some perched on rocky ledges, others coiled around marble pillars that had stood for thousands of years. The air crackled with tension and barely contained power. Drakmor the Eternal is dead. Pyraxis roared, his voice echoing off the cavern walls like thunder. The words hit the gathered dragons like a physical blow. Several younger dragons stumbled backward, unable to believe what they had heard. Drakmor had ruled them for 3,000 years. He was supposed to be immortal, unchanging, eternal. Yet here they were, staring at his empty throne carved from a single massive emerald. The silence that followed lasted only seconds before chaos erupted. Dragons roared in confusion, fear, and anger. Some demanded to see the body. Others called for immediate succession. The ancient laws were clear but had never been tested in living memory. Leadership belonged to the strongest dragon, the one who could defeat all challenges in combat. Duchess Scarlet was the first to make her move. Her crimson scales gleamed like fresh blood as she spread wings that could block out the sun. Fire danced between her teeth as she landed in the center of the chamber with a crash that sent smaller dragons scattering. "I am the strongest," she declared, her voice carrying the heat of a volcano. "The throne is mine by right." But Storm Lord Magnus disagreed. Electricity crackled around his silver form as he descended from the highest perch. Lightning danced between his claws, and thunder rolled with every beat of his wings. "Your fire burns hot, Scarlet, but my storms command the very sky." Blue energy arced across his scales as he landed opposite her, the stone beneath his feet cracking from the electrical discharge. From the shadows came a low, menacing chuckle. Shadow Weaver Damon materialized slowly, first as wisps of darkness, then solidifying into his true form. His black scales seemed to absorb light itself, making him appear as a living void. "You both speak of power," he said, his voice like whispers in a graveyard, "but what good is fire or lightning against an enemy you cannot see?" He vanished and reappeared behind them both, demonstrating his point. The three dragons circled each other like predators, each convinced of their own superiority. Other dragons pressed against the chamber walls, knowing that when these titans clashed, anywhere nearby would become a battlefield. The air grew thick with magical energy as each dragon prepared for combat. Scarlet struck first, breathing a column of white-hot flame that could melt steel. Magnus countered with a lightning bolt that split the fire in two. Damon disappeared entirely, reappearing behind Scarlet to rake his claws across her flank. She roared in pain and fury, spinning to snap at him with jaws that could bite through mountain stone. Their battle shook the entire mountain. Ancient stalactites crashed down as the dragons unleashed their full power. Magnus's lightning turned the chamber into a strobe light of destruction. Scarlet's flames scorched the walls black. Damon's shadows seemed to swallow light itself, creating pockets of absolute darkness that disoriented everyone. The fight raged for hours, neither dragon able to gain a decisive advantage. They were too evenly matched, each possessing different types of power that countered the others. The mountain itself began to crack under the strain of their battle. Rocks tumbled down the slopes, and avalanches thundered into the valleys below where humans lived. Miles away in the small settlement of Millbrook, 17-year-old Jake looked up from his work as the ground trembled beneath his feet. He was kneeling in the herb garden of an old monastery that had been abandoned for decades. The building was falling apart, with vines growing through broken windows and moss covering the stone walls. But Jake had made it his home, the only home he had ever known. Jake was an orphan, left at the monastery as a baby with nothing but a blanket and his name written on a piece of paper. The monks had raised him until they too grew old and passed away, leaving him alone with only the injured animals he cared for as company. He had gentle hands and a patient heart, able to calm even the most frightened creatures. Right now, he was carefully bandaging the wing of a red-tailed hawk that had crashed into a tree during a storm. The bird should have been snapping and clawing at him, but instead, it sat perfectly still, trusting the strange human who spoke to it in soft, soothing tones. "Easy there, friend," Jake whispered, his fingers working carefully around the delicate bones. "I know it hurts, but you'll be flying again soon." The hawk tilted its head, golden eyes watching his every movement with what almost looked like understanding. Jake had no idea that other golden eyes were watching him too. Deep in the mountain caves, far below where the dragon lords battled, something ancient stirred in the darkness. These eyes had been closed for centuries, but the violence above had awakened their owner. Through cracks in the stone, the ancient being watched the young human tend to his patient with infinite gentleness. The watcher had seen empires rise and fall, had witnessed countless battles and wars. But this simple act of kindness toward a wounded creature was something different, something that stirred memories of what the world could be instead of what it had become. The war in the skies had been going on for 3 weeks now, and Jake could see the damage from his little monastery. Every morning brought new scorch marks on the mountainsides where Duchess Scarlet's flames had hit the rock. The valleys echoed with the crash of Magnus's thunder, and strange shadows moved across the landscape wherever Damon had passed through. The 3 dragon lords fought day and night, none willing to give up their claim to the throne. People from the nearby villages had started fleeing. Jake watched from his garden as families loaded their belongings onto carts and headed south, away from the dragon battles. Children cried as their parents hurried them along, and old folks looked back sadly at homes they might never see again. The smart ones were getting out while they still could. But Jake had nowhere else to go, and besides, the injured animals in his care couldn't travel. On this particular morning, Jake filled his herb basket and set out on his usual walk through the forest. The plants he needed for his healing salves grew best in the deeper woods, away from the monastery. He had been making this trip for years, following the same winding paths between the tall pine trees. The forest felt different now though, quieter somehow. Even the birds seemed nervous, and Jake noticed that many of the usual woodland creatures were missing. He was searching for silverleaf moss near a rocky outcrop when he heard it, a sound like distant thunder, but deeper, more pained. It came from somewhere beyond the ridge, in a part of the forest Jake rarely visited. Curiosity got the better of him, and he climbed over the rocks to investigate. What he found on the other side made him stop dead in his tracks. A massive ravine cut deep into the earth, hidden by overhanging trees and thick brush. And lying at the bottom, barely fitting in the space between the rocky walls, was the largest dragon Jake had ever seen or even imagined. The creature was enormous, easily 3 times the size of the battling dragons he had glimpsed in the distance. Its scales were deep black, but not the shiny black of Shadow Weaver Damon. These scales looked old and weathered, dulled by countless centuries. Some were cracked, and others had fallen away entirely, leaving patches of raw, infected skin underneath. The dragon's breathing was slow and labored, each exhale creating small clouds of steam in the cool morning air. Its wings were folded tight against its body, but Jake could see tears in the leathery membrane. This was clearly a creature in great pain, and Jake's healer instincts kicked in immediately. He scrambled down the steep sides of the ravine, his herb basket bouncing against his hip. Loose rocks scattered under his feet, but he managed to reach the bottom without falling. Up close, the dragon was even more massive than he had thought. Its head alone was bigger than Jake's entire body. The young man approached slowly, speaking in the same gentle voice he used with frightened animals. "Easy there, big guy," he whispered, just like he had with countless injured creatures over the years. "I'm not going to hurt you." He could see the wounds more clearly now. Deep gashes ran along the dragon's flank, old injuries that had never healed properly. The flesh around them was swollen and hot to the touch, clear signs of infection. Without thinking, Jake reached into his basket and pulled out his supplies. That's when one massive golden eye opened, fixing on Jake with an intensity that should have sent him running in terror. This wasn't just any dragon, this was something ancient, something that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. The eye was larger than Jake's head, and in its depths swelled the wisdom and weariness of ages. The dragon expected the human to scream, to fall to his knees in worship, or to flee in panic. That's what humans always did when faced with dragonkind. But instead, this strange young man simply continued his examination of the wounds, his hands gentle and sure as he cleaned away dried blood and pus. "Why do you not run, little one?" the dragon asked, his voice rumbling up from depths that seemed to shake the very ground. Each word was carefully formed, spoken in the old tongue that few humans even remembered. Jake looked up from his work, meeting that ancient gaze without flinching. He shrugged in that casual way young people do when asked to explain something that seems obvious to them. "You're hurt," he said simply, already mixing healing herbs into a paste. "That's all that matters." The dragon, who was indeed Titan the Worldbreaker, eldest of all dragonkind, felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in over 1,000 years. Wonder. Pure, simple wonder at this mortal's compassion. Legends told that Titan had died centuries ago in a great battle, but the truth was different. He had grown tired of the endless violence, the constant struggles for power among his kind. He had withdrawn to this hidden place to sleep away the ages, hoping to wake to a better world. But the world hadn't changed. If anything, it had gotten worse. Yet here was this one human, this orphan boy with gentle hands, showing him a kindness that none of his own kind had offered in millennia. As Jake worked to clean and dress his wounds, Titan began to remember what he had almost forgotten, that there was still good in the world, still reason to hope. The healing salve Jake applied was surprisingly effective, and for the first time in centuries, the ancient dragon felt some relief from his pain. More importantly, he felt something he had thought lost forever, a connection to another living being based not on fear or power, but on simple, honest care. The news traveled through the dragon realm faster than wildfire. Dragons had an incredible network of communication, using their keen senses and ancient magic to spread information across vast distances. Within hours of Jake's first meeting with Titan, every dragon in the mountains knew that the Worldbreaker still lived. But what truly shocked them was the second part of the message: a human boy was caring for him, and Titan seemed to trust this mortal completely. In the Great Council chamber, the three claimants stopped their endless fighting when the news reached them. Duchess Scarlet's flames died down to barely glowing embers as she processed what she had heard. Stormlord Magnus's lightning flickered and went out entirely. Even Shadow Weaver Damon materialized fully from the darkness, his usual tricks forgotten in his surprise. "This cannot be true," Scarlet hissed, her voice filled with disbelief. "Titan the Worldbreaker died 3 centuries ago. Every dragon knows this." Magnus shook his great silver head, electricity sparking nervously between his claws. "The stories say he fell in the Battle of the Burning Peaks. His body was never found, but we assumed." "We assumed wrong," Damon interrupted, his dark eyes narrowing. "But even if he lives, why would he allow some human child to tend to him? We are the superior race. Humans are nothing but insects compared to our power." The other dragons in the chamber whispered among themselves, sharing the same confusion and outrage. Dragons had always been the dominant species, the rulers of the skies and mountains. Humans lived in their shadow, sometimes worshipping them as gods, sometimes fearing them as monsters, but always acknowledging dragons' superiority. The idea that one of their own, especially their most ancient and powerful elder, would treat a human as an equal was beyond their understanding. Elder Pyraxis, who had remained silent during the three claimants' conversation, finally spoke up. "There is only one way to learn the truth," he said, his aged voice carrying the weight of centuries. "We must go to him ourselves and demand an explanation." The journey to Titan's hidden ravine took most of the day. The three claimants flew in formation, their massive forms blocking out the sun as they passed overhead. Behind them came dozens of other dragons, all curious to see this impossible situation for themselves. The sound of their wings created a wind that bent trees and scattered leaves across the forest floor below. When they reached the ravine, they found Titan waiting for them on a wide ledge of rock. The ancient dragon looked stronger than he had in centuries, his scales gleaming with new health. But what truly stunned the assembled dragons was the sight of Jake sitting calmly on Titan's neck, showing no fear whatsoever as he faced the most powerful creatures in the world. Duchess Scarlet landed first, her claws digging deep grooves in the stone. Her eyes blazed with indignation as she looked up at the legendary Worldbreaker. "Choose among us, Ancient One," she commanded, her voice echoing off the canyon walls like a battle cry. "The throne stands empty, and we three have proven ourselves worthy through combat. You must decide which of us shall rule." Magnus landed beside her with a crash of thunder, electricity dancing along his silver scales. "Yes," he agreed, his voice rumbling like a storm. "End this conflict and name your successor. Surely you cannot support that shadow creeper Damon, or this flame-headed female. I am clearly the strongest." Damon materialized from the darkness at the ravine's edge, his form solidifying like smoke becoming flesh. "They both speak foolishly, Elder Titan. Power comes from cunning, not brute force. I am the obvious choice to lead our people into a new age." The three claimants glared at each other, their old animosity flaring up even in Titan's presence. Other dragons perched on rocky outcroppings around the ravine, waiting to see how their eldest would settle this dispute. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like the calm before a terrible storm. Titan rose to his full height, his ancient form towering over even the three claimants. Jake held on calmly, his hands gripping the dragon's scales with practiced ease. When Titan spoke, his voice carried the weight of millennia, and every dragon present fell silent to listen. "I choose neither of you," he declared, his words hitting the assembled dragons like a physical blow. "This human shall lead." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Dragons roared in outrage and disbelief. Some took to the air in shock, while others pressed closer, unable to believe what they had heard. Scarlet's flames burst to life again, hotter than before. Magnus's electricity crackled so violently that sparks flew in all directions. Even Damon lost control of his shadows, darkness swirling chaotically around him. "Impossible!" Magnus shouted, his voice nearly lost in the electrical storm surrounding him. No mortal commands dragonkind. It goes against everything we are, everything we stand for. Scarlet's eyes glowed like molten gold as she stared at Jake with pure hatred. You jest, Ancient One. This child could not lead a flock of sheep, let alone the dragon nation. He has no power, no strength, no fire in his blood. Elder Pyraxis, who had flown with the group to witness this meeting, slowly raised one clawed hand for silence. The gesture carried such authority that even the three claimants grudgingly quieted their protests. The old dragon's eyes were thoughtful as he considered this unprecedented situation. The ancient laws are clear, Pyraxis said carefully, his voice carrying to every dragon present. Leadership belongs to whoever can demonstrate mastery over dragonkind. If this. He paused, looking at Jake with obvious skepticism. Child can prove his authority over dragons by sunset tomorrow, then by law we must acknowledge his right to lead. But, his voice grew harder, failure means exile for both him and any dragon who supports him. Jake felt his heart start pounding like a war drum in his chest. The magnitude of what was being asked hit him all at once. These were creatures that could level cities, dragons whose individual power exceeded that of entire human armies. How could he, an orphan with no special abilities, possibly prove mastery over them? But then he looked into Titan's ancient golden eyes and saw something there that gave him courage, complete trust and faith in his abilities. The great dragon believed in him, even if Jake didn't believe in himself yet. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, Jake straightened his shoulders and met Elder Pyraxis' gaze directly. I accept, he said, his voice surprisingly strong despite the fear churning in his stomach. The greatest and most impossible challenge in dragon history had officially begun. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ravine as Jake climbed down from Titan's neck to face the impossible task ahead of him. Every dragon in the realm had gathered to witness this historic moment. They perched on rocky ledges, coiled around ancient trees, and filled the sky above like a living storm cloud. Their eyes glowed with curiosity, skepticism, and in many cases, barely contained hostility. Jake had spent the night thinking about what he was supposed to do. How does someone prove mastery over dragons? The traditional way would be through combat, magical power, or displays of supernatural strength. But Jake was just a 17-year-old orphan who could barely lift a full water bucket. He had no weapons, no magic spells, and certainly no hope of defeating even the smallest dragon in physical combat. But as he looked up at the three mighty claimants watching him from their elevated positions, Jake realized something important. He didn't need to beat them, he needed to understand them. After all, that's what had worked with Titan, and with every injured animal he had ever helped. Sometimes the greatest strength came not from force, but from simply caring enough to listen. Jake walked slowly toward Duchess Scarlet, who was perched on a large boulder with her crimson wings folded tight against her body. Her eyes burned like coals as she watched him approach, flames dancing between her teeth. Other dragons whispered among themselves, wondering if the human boy had lost his mind. Approaching an angry dragon was usually the last thing anyone ever did. I know you're furious, Jake said softly, sitting down cross-legged on the ground in front of her massive form. But I don't think you're angry at me, or even at Titan for choosing me. You're angry about something else, something that happened a long time ago. Scarlet's flames flared higher, and for a moment Jake thought she might incinerate him on the spot. But instead of attacking, she began to speak, her voice filled with centuries of rage and pain. Human hunters came to my nest 50 years ago, she snarled, her voice shaking with emotion. They climbed the highest peak where I had built my home, where my 3 eggs were just beginning to crack open. They wanted dragon scales for their armor, dragon claws for their weapons. They killed my babies before they could even take their first breath. The gathered dragons fell silent as Scarlet's story poured out like molten lava. She had never spoken of this tragedy before, had buried her grief beneath layers of anger and violence. Jake listened without interrupting, his heart breaking for the pain she had carried alone for so long. I understand your anger, Jake said quietly when she finished. You lost your children. That kind of pain never really goes away, does it? It just sits inside you like a cold stone, making everything hurt. Something incredible happened then. Scarlet's flames, which had burned bright and hot for decades, slowly dimmed to barely glowing embers. Her massive form seemed to shrink as the tension left her body. No one, not even other dragons, had ever acknowledged her grief. They had seen only her rage, never understanding the heartbreak beneath it. You understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. For the first time in 50 years, Duchess Scarlet felt truly heard. Next, Jake turned his attention to Storm Lord Magnus, whose silver scales crackled with barely contained electricity. The dragon's power was magnificent and terrifying. He could call down lightning from clear skies and summon tornadoes with a beat of his wings. But Jake sensed something else beneath all that raw energy. Magnus unleashed a furious tempest as Jake approached, winds howling and lightning splitting the air around them. Lesser beings would have been torn apart instantly, but Jake stood his ground, not fighting the storm but simply enduring it. He closed his eyes and let the wind whip through his hair, trusting that Magnus wouldn't actually harm him. When the storm finally calmed, Jake opened his eyes and looked directly at the great silver dragon. "Your storms are incredible," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "I bet you can protect the entire realm with your power. But I noticed something: your lightning scars the mountainsides, and your winds knock down the forests. You're trying to save the villages below, but sometimes your protection causes as much damage as the threats you're fighting." Magnus froze, electricity still sparking between his claws. In all his centuries of existence, no one had ever pointed out this painful contradiction. He was so powerful that even his attempts to help often caused destruction. The dragon had always wondered why the humans he protected seemed to fear him as much as they thanked him. "I never meant to hurt anyone," Magnus admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I only wanted to keep everyone safe." "I know you did," Jake replied gently. "That's what makes you a true protector. You care about others more than yourself." Finally, Jake faced the most challenging claimant of all, Shadow Weaver Damon. The dark dragon was almost impossible to see clearly, his form shifting between solid flesh and living shadow. He appeared and disappeared at will, sometimes speaking from the darkness, sometimes manifesting just behind Jake's shoulder to test his nerves. But Jake had spent years working with frightened animals, creatures that hid in dark corners and emerged only when they felt safe. He recognized the behavior patterns, even in a dragon. "Being alone hurts, doesn't it?" Jake said softly to the shifting shadows. "That's why you hide all the time. It's easier to disappear than to risk getting close to someone who might leave you." The shadows stopped moving. For a long moment, there was complete silence in the ravine. Then, slowly, Damon materialized fully for the first time in decades. His black scales weren't as dark as they appeared from a distance, they were deep blue, like the night sky just before dawn. His eyes, which Jake had expected to be cold and calculating, were filled with a loneliness so deep it was almost physical. "How did you know?" Damon whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "I am the Shadow Weaver. I am supposed to be mysterious, powerful, feared." "You're supposed to be whatever makes you happy," Jake replied. "But I don't think hiding in the darkness makes you happy at all. I think it just makes you lonely." One by one, Jake had spoken to each dragon not as a conqueror seeking to dominate them, but as a healer trying to understand their pain. He offered them something no one else ever had: compassion without judgment, acceptance without conditions. He saw past their fearsome exteriors to the wounded souls beneath. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, something unprecedented happened in the dragon realm. The three mighty claimants, each powerful enough to level mountains, slowly lowered themselves until they knelt before the human boy. It wasn't surrender, it was recognition. They had found something they had never known they were looking for: a leader who served rather than commanded, who healed rather than conquered, who saw their worth beyond their power. The watching dragons murmured in amazement as their greatest warriors bowed to a mortal child, not in defeat, but in respect and hope for a better future. The golden light of sunset painted the rocky canyon walls in brilliant shades of orange and red as Jake stood in the center of the great gathering. Dragons filled every available space, perched on ledges, coiled around massive boulders, and hovering in the air above. Their eyes, which had glowed with skepticism and hostility just hours before, now watched him with something entirely different: hope. Jake looked small and fragile surrounded by these magnificent creatures, each one capable of leveling entire cities. He wore the same simple brown tunic he had put on that morning, patched in several places and stained with herbs from his healing work. His hair was still messy from the wind, and dirt smudged his hands from sitting on the ground all day. He looked exactly like what he was: a 17-year-old orphan who had stumbled into the most important moment in dragon history. But something had changed in those few hours of conversation with the three claimants. The dragons could sense it, could see it in the way Jake carried himself now. He had found his purpose, his calling, and it showed in every gesture he made. "I need to tell you all something important," Jake began, his voice carrying clearly through the canyon despite its quiet tone. "I don't want to rule you. I never wanted power over anyone or anything. That's not what this is about." Elder Pyraxis shifted on his ancient perch, his weathered face showing confusion. For thousands of years, Every challenge for dragon leadership had been about seizing power, about proving dominance over others. What Jake was saying went against everything they had ever known. Jake continued, looking around at the sea of dragon faces surrounding him. I want to serve alongside you instead. I want to help you heal the wounds you've been carrying, just like I helped Titan heal his. Humans and dragons have been afraid of each other for so long that we've forgotten we could be friends instead. He paused, gathering his thoughts before speaking the words that would change everything. Look at what fear has cost us all. Dragons hide in mountain caves because they think humans hate them. Humans flee to distant lands because they think dragons want to destroy them. But what if we're both wrong? What if we could be partners instead of enemies? The silence that followed was complete. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as hundreds of dragons processed this revolutionary idea. Partnership with humans? It was unthinkable. It was impossible. It was brilliant, whispered Duchess Scarlet, her voice carrying to every corner of the canyon. She rose from where she knelt, her crimson scales catching the last light of day. You healed wounds we didn't even know we were carrying. For 50 years I've been angry at all humans because of what a few hunters did. But you showed me that hatred was poisoning my own heart. Stormlord Magnus lifted his great silver head, electricity dancing gently between his claws for the first time in decades instead of crackling with violent energy. Your strength doesn't come from having power over others, he said, his voice filled with wonder. It comes from lifting others up, from helping them become the best versions of themselves. I've been so focused on being the strongest that I forgot why I wanted to protect people in the first place. The most surprising change came from Shadow Weaver Damon. The dark dragon, who had spent centuries hiding in darkness and shadow, stepped fully into the golden sunlight. His scales, revealed clearly for the first time in living memory, weren't the pure black that everyone had assumed. They were deep midnight blue, beautiful and mysterious but no longer hidden. We have a new title for you, Damon said, his voice steady and clear without the whispered menace it had carried for so long. Not ruler, not commander, not lord of dragons. We name you Dragon Speaker, the bridge between our peoples, the voice that helps us understand each other. The canyon erupted in a sound unlike anything ever heard before. Hundreds of dragons roared their approval, but it wasn't the angry, threatening sound of battle. It was joyful, celebratory, filled with hope for the future. The sound echoed off the mountain peaks and rolled across the valleys below, where human refugees heard it and wondered if something wonderful had just happened. Over the weeks and months that followed, Jake's simple idea began to transform the entire realm. Dragons emerged from their mountain lairs not as conquerors but as protectors. Duchess Scarlet used her flames to clear dangerous avalanche zones, keeping mountain passes safe for travelers. Stormlord Magnus learned to control his tempests with precision, bringing gentle rains to drought-stricken farmlands instead of destructive storms. Shadow Weaver Damon became a guardian of the night, watching over villages while people slept and ensuring that no bandits or wild beasts could threaten innocent families. His ability to move unseen made him the perfect protector, and children began leaving small gifts outside their windows to thank the Shadow Guardian who kept them safe. The humans, initially terrified by the sudden appearance of dragons in their daily lives, slowly began to understand that these magnificent creatures wanted to help, not harm. Farmers shared their harvests with dragon partners who had protected their crops from storms and pests. Craftsmen learned to work dragon scales and shed claws into beautiful jewelry and tools, given freely rather than taken by force. Jake found himself busier than ever, traveling from village to village and cave to cave, helping dragons and humans learn to communicate and trust each other. He taught humans that dragons had feelings and fears just like they did. He showed dragons that humans weren't all greedy and violent, that most of them just wanted to live peaceful lives with their families. Titan watched it all with immense pride, seeing his young friend accomplish something that centuries of dragon rule had never achieved. True peace based on understanding rather than fear. The ancient dragon often accompanied Jake on his journeys, serving as both protector and living proof that even the mightiest beings could choose compassion over conquest. Villages that had been abandoned during the Dragon Civil War slowly came back to life. Children who had only known dragons as monsters from scary stories now played games with young dragons who were learning to be gentle. Scholars from both species began working together to share knowledge and solve problems that had plagued the realm for generations. The transformation wasn't always easy. There were misunderstandings, accidents, and moments when old fears and prejudices surfaced. But whenever conflicts arose, people knew they could call for the Dragon Speaker, and Jake would come to listen, to understand, and to help heal whatever wounds had opened. As the first winter under the new arrangement arrived, Jake stood on a hilltop overlooking a valley where dragons and humans worked together to prepare for the cold months ahead. Dragon fire warmed communal shelters while human hands crafted warm clothing and preserved food. The sight filled his heart with a joy he had never imagined possible. This was the new age, not an age of conquest or domination, but an age of cooperation and friendship. True strength wasn't measured by the ability to destroy enemies, but by the wisdom to turn enemies into friends and to heal the wounds that divided people from each other. In the end, a simple orphan boy with gentle hands had accomplished what no army or magic spell ever could. He had brought peace to a world that had forgotten what peace looked like.